I've spent the last 7 years waiting for you to recognize me, and the last 3 of those deliberately staying invisible. The irony is that you walk past my restaurant at least twice a month, I've timed it, and you've never once looked up from your phone to notice that the small brass plaque beside the entrance bears a name that should mean nothing to you. But it means everything. It always has. By the time you recognize me, it will already be too late. The evidence will be public, the damage will be irreversible, and you'll understand exactly why I've spent half a decade of my life orchestrating this moment. That's what this confession is for. To explain not just what I did, but why I became someone capable of doing it. I was 20 years old when I walked into your lecture hall, and I had never felt so certain about anything in my life. My parents had sacrificed everything for my education. They weren't wealthy, but they were invested in their daughter's future, and I was going to prove their faith in me was justified. I'd always loved cooking, but more than that, I loved the science of it, the chemistry, the precision. I wasn't just interested in food. I was obsessed with understanding how flavors worked at a molecular level, how temperature and time could transform raw ingredients into art. Professor Marcus Hendricks was teaching the honors seminar on food science that first semester. He was 43, accomplished, published in academic journals, the kind of professor who looked like he'd stepped out of a film about intellectual men at their peak. He had that particular charisma that comes from genuine expertise mixed with a willingness to make himself seem accessible. He wore his silver streaking through dark hair like an asset, and he had this way of leaning against his desk when he taught that made you feel like he was speaking directly to you, even when he was addressing 40 students. I'm aware of how this sounds now. I'm aware that I'm describing a man who exploited that exact dynamic. But at the time, it felt like recognition. He noticed me in the 3rd week of classes. I remember because I remember the exact question I asked. He was discussing Maillard reactions, explaining the chemistry of browning, and I asked him about the threshold temperatures and whether cultural cooking methods that didn't reach those temperatures had discovered something we hadn't quantified yet. It was a good question. It showed I'd actually read ahead. He told me afterward, when I lingered while other students filed out, that I had a real mind for this. That I saw beyond the textbook. That it was rare to find students with both curiosity and the willingness to challenge accepted frameworks. I was 20 years old. I'd never had a mentor before. My high school teachers had been fine, my parents supportive but not educated in my field, and suddenly here was this accomplished man telling me that I had something special. That I wasn't just smart, I was thinking like a scientist. He invited me to attend his weekly office hours, even though I wasn't technically his advisee. He said he wanted to recommend some research papers that might interest me. Looking back, I can see the grooming pattern with perfect clarity. The way he started giving me special recommendations, making me feel discovered and cultivated. The way he'd mentioned that most students weren't as serious as I was, as dedicated. The way he began discussing his own research, his challenges in the department, his marriages, he was on his 2nd, he mentioned, as if we were colleagues rather than professor and student. By the winter of that first year, I was spending time in his office at least 3 times a week. We were ostensibly working on an independent research project, something about heat transfer efficiency in commercial kitchens. In reality, I was falling into an emotional relationship with a man who was systematically isolating me from my peers. I didn't sleep with him. That's important to establish, because it matters to the story, and it's why he probably thought he hadn't really done anything wrong. What he did instead was far more insidious. In my sophomore year, he invited me to his home to review research in his personal library. His wife was absent that evening. He told me she was at her sister's, a detail he wouldn't have needed to mention unless he wanted me to know we'd be alone. Nothing happened physically that night either, but something happened psychologically. He told me that he'd been thinking about my future, that the traditional academic path might not be right for me, that I had the soul of a true culinary artist rather than a researcher. He said this while we sat very close on his couch, while he'd placed his hand on my knee to make a point, while he'd angled his body toward mine. He told me I should defer my major, that I should take his advanced seminar instead of the standard courses, that we could design an independent study that would be far more valuable for someone with my particular talents. And all of this, every moment of it, was framed as him looking out for me, protecting my potential, seeing me as something more than I was. I was 19 going on 14 in terms of emotional intelligence, and I believed him. What I didn't know was that he was simultaneously cultivating relationships with 2 other female students. I found out later, years later, when I actually had the courage to look. There was Sarah, a junior who was also in his advanced seminar, and there was Jennifer, a sophomore like me, who was also receiving special mentoring. We didn't know about each other. We were isolated, individual projects. The betrayal didn't come in a single moment. It came gradually, like a gas leak, filling the room with something toxic that I learned to breathe and forgot to notice. First, he started giving me poor grades on work that I knew was excellent. He said it was because I had so much potential that he held me to a higher standard. He said average work from me was unacceptable, that he couldn't grade me the way he graded other students because that would be doing me a disservice. I believed him. I worked harder. Then he started recommending I take courses with other professors, saying that my research would benefit from different perspectives. Those professors didn't know that he'd already been in their offices, speaking to them privately about me. I found out much later, 5 years later, that he'd told them I had emotional issues, that I was gifted but fragile, that they should be aware of that when grading my work. He was systematically undermining my credibility while positioning himself as my only true advocate. Then came the real damage. In the spring of my junior year, I submitted a proposal for my senior thesis. I'd spent 6 months on it. It was original research into the chemical compounds that develop in high-altitude cooking and how they might be replicated in standard kitchens. I was proud of it. I showed it to him first, because by then he was the person whose opinion mattered most to me. He said it was derivative. He said it had been done before, essentially, and that I was wasting my time. He suggested I start over, that he had some ideas for a truly original project. I should defer my graduation, take another year. I didn't know what I now know, that one of his other students, Sarah, had already begun similar research. He was going to steer me away from the idea so she wouldn't have competition. He was also going to steer her away from me so we wouldn't realize we were working on similar concepts. But I didn't defer my graduation. I was stubborn enough to push back on that. I said I wanted to submit my thesis as written. And he said, fine, but I need to tell you something first, and it's going to be difficult to hear. He told me that in 3 weeks, there was going to be a meeting of the department's Academic Integrity Committee. He said a student, he wouldn't name her, but he said it was a female student in the food science program, had accused him of inappropriate relationships with students. He said the accusation was completely baseless, a fabrication by someone who'd been rejected when she'd made romantic advances toward him, and he was telling me this so I'd understand what might be said about our relationship. He told me that people might misinterpret our mentorship, that they might suggest he'd taken advantage of me. He said I should be prepared to defend him, to make it clear that our relationship was entirely appropriate and professional. He said this while looking at me with such vulnerability, such fear, that I immediately forgot about every uncomfortable moment, every boundary he crossed. He was the victim. He was being attacked. And I was the one person who could save his reputation. The Academic Integrity Committee meeting happened. Sarah was the student who'd filed the complaint. She described incidents that made my skin crawl, things he'd said to her, things he'd done. But she had no witnesses, no evidence beyond her own testimony and a couple of diary entries. The committee decided it was a he said she said situation. And then they called me to testify. I was 19 years old. I was deeply emotionally invested in a man who'd systematically manipulated me. When they asked me if Professor Hendricks had ever acted inappropriately toward me, I said no. I said he'd been nothing but supportive and professional. I said he was an exemplary mentor and a credit to the university. I didn't know that the other student, Jennifer, would testify differently. But she did. She described things that he'd done to her that were similar to what Sarah described. 2 complaints, but they'd called 3 of us as character witnesses, and 2 of us had defended him. The committee concluded there wasn't enough evidence to pursue formal charges. They recommended he attend some training and that his student interactions be monitored more closely. He was essentially exonerated. Sarah left the university at the end of that semester. Jennifer transferred schools. Both of them quietly disappeared, and I was left thinking they were the problem. That they'd misinterpreted normal mentorship. That I'd been right to defend him. The revenge of a manipulated person is often directed at the wrong targets first. I began to hate Sarah and Jennifer. I convinced myself they'd made false accusations against a good man. I distanced myself from other students, sure now that people were cruel and prone to fabrication. I became more dependent on him, more isolated. He'd essentially turned me into his alibi. And once I was that, he had no more use for me. The shift happened subtly. He had less time for my office visits. He was traveling more for conferences. He mentioned that he decided to focus more on his marriage, that his wife had been upset about the time he spent mentoring students. He said he'd need to scale back our sessions. I remember feeling abandoned, hurt, like I'd been discarded. I remember begging, actually begging, for continued mentoring. He gently refused, saying it would be better for both of us. He said I was ready to stand on my own now, that I didn't need him anymore. He made it seem like my independence was a gift he was giving me, a graduation present. What I didn't understand was that I'd served my purpose. I'd testified on his behalf. I'd damaged 2 women's credibility. And now I was worthless to him. My senior thesis, the one he'd discouraged me from pursuing, was rejected. The committee said it lacked originality, that it showed derivative thinking. My GPA suffered. My confidence was in ruins. I applied to graduate programs and was rejected from most of them. I got into one, a mediocre program at a state university that was essentially the academic equivalent of a participation trophy. I didn't graduate summa cum laude like I'd planned. I graduated with honors, which sounds good until you realize you should have graduated at the top of your class, and you know it. I knew it. Everyone I'd told about my ambitions knew it. I told my parents it was because I'd changed directions, that I wanted to pursue cooking rather than research. It wasn't entirely a lie. By that point, I was desperate to escape the academic world, escape the place where Marcus Hendricks was still teaching, still mentoring, still ruining people. I spent 2 years in that graduate program feeling like an imposter. I was good at cooking, genuinely good, but I was also broken in a way I couldn't articulate. I'd been betrayed by someone I trusted, manipulated into betraying others, and then discarded when I was no longer useful. And nobody knew. Nobody else in my life understood why I was struggling because I'd never told them what had happened. I couldn't tell them. I was too ashamed. I was ashamed of not recognizing the manipulation while it was happening. I was ashamed that I'd testified against Sarah and Jennifer. I was ashamed that I'd been foolish enough to trust him. The depression hit hard in the 2nd year of graduate school. I stopped showing up to classes. I slept for 16 hours at a time. I lost weight. I had panic attacks in restaurants of all places because the precision and heat and pressure suddenly felt suffocating. My advisor, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, noticed. She actually pulled me into her office and asked if I was okay. And I broke. For the first time, I told someone the whole story, not all of it, but enough. I told her about Marcus Hendricks, about the mentoring, about how I defended him against accusations, and it had cost me. Dr. Chen listened without interrupting. And then she told me something that changed everything. She told me that Marcus Hendricks had a history. that he'd been reported before. That in 1998, a student had filed a complaint that was settled quietly out of court. That in 2003, there had been another incident that the university had paid off. That Sarah and Jennifer's complaints were part of a pattern, not isolated incidents. She told me that he'd gotten away with it because young women like me, like Sarah, like Jennifer, couldn't see the manipulation until it was too late, and by then he'd already turned at least one of us against the others. She told me that I needed to consider reporting what had happened to me. I didn't. I was too damaged, too ashamed, too convinced that it was my fault for being stupid enough to fall for it. Instead, I dropped out of graduate school, moved to a new city, and tried to rebuild my life from nothing. I got a job at a small restaurant in Portland, working as a line cook. It was minimum wage, 16-hour days, physical and demanding, and exactly what I needed. For the first time in years, I could turn off my brain and just work with my hands. There was no room for thinking about Marcus Hendricks when you were trying not to burn the hollandaise. I was good at it. Better than good. I had an instinct for flavor and technique that other cooks didn't have, partly because of the science I'd learned, partly because I was obsessive about perfection. Over the next 5 years, I moved up. Sous chef at 25. Head chef at 27. By 30, I'd opened my own restaurant. The restaurant was called Reclamation. I didn't tell anyone why I chose that name. I told people I wanted to reclaim my love of cooking, to reclaim my confidence. That was true, but it was also incomplete. I wanted to reclaim the life that Marcus Hendricks had stolen from me. The restaurant was wildly successful. I got press. I was profiled in food magazines. A documentary crew came to film a day in my kitchen. Slowly, I rebuilt not just my career, but my reputation, my confidence, my sense of self-worth. But underneath all of it, there was still rage. It's not the kind of rage that makes you violent. It's the kind that makes you patient. It makes you strategic. It makes you willing to plan something over 7 years, knowing that the payoff might not come immediately. When I was 32, I started researching Marcus Hendricks. I found his faculty page. I found his research publications. I found his social media presence. And I found evidence of Sarah. Sarah had become a successful food scientist herself. She'd published research in peer-reviewed journals on flavor chemistry and heat transfer, the exact research that I'd been discouraged from pursuing and that he'd been encouraging Jennifer to do instead. She'd made a career out of the idea he'd told me was derivative and unoriginal. She'd won prestigious awards. I reached out to her. Not directly, I was too careful for that, but through a mutual contact, someone I'd met at a food conference who knew her professionally. I asked about her background, her early education, her experience in academic settings. She told me about Marcus Hendricks. And then I asked if she'd be willing to have coffee with me. I told her over that coffee, in a small shop in Seattle, what had happened to me. I told her I'd testified against her. I told her I was sorry. She looked at me for a long time. And then she said, I wondered if you were real or if he'd made you up. That was the moment I understood the full scope of what he'd done. He told Sarah and Jennifer about me, probably using me as proof that not all his students found him problematic. He'd weaponized my testimony against them. Sarah didn't forgive me. I didn't expect her to. But she did tell me that Jennifer was now living in New York, that she'd gone into event planning instead of food science, that she'd essentially been driven out of her field. She told me that she'd tried to report him again, later, when she had more confidence and evidence, but by then there wasn't enough to prosecute. The university had paid a settlement and added more restrictions, but he was still teaching. He was still mentoring students. Every few years, Sarah said, I find another student online who seems to be under his spell. And I try to reach out to them. And sometimes they believe me, and sometimes they don't. She was still trying to save the people he was destroying. That night, I went home and I started to plan. It took me 3 years of preparation. 3 years of collecting evidence, building relationships, and setting traps. I started with Jennifer. I reached out to her through Facebook, apologizing for my testimony, asking if she'd consider talking to me. She was skeptical, but eventually she agreed to meet. We had lunch in New York, and I recorded the conversation. She told me about things he'd done to her that were unambiguous harassment. He'd shown up at her apartment uninvited. He'd sent her emails that were clearly sexual in nature. He'd told her he was ending their mentoring because his wife was upset about her, which she'd realized was his way of controlling her. Then I contacted Jennifer's roommate from that time. They were still in touch on social media, and asked if she remembered the year Jennifer was seeing Marcus Hendricks. She did. She remembered Jennifer being upset, remembered some late-night conversations about how confused and hurt she felt. Next, I started looking into his wife. Her name was Catherine. I found her on Instagram. She was an artist, and she posted images of her work regularly. I noticed a pattern. She'd gone through periods where she posted very little, and these periods seemed to correspond with certain years in Marcus's career, years when he'd likely been involved with students. I hired a private investigator. I told them I was working on exposing an abuser, and I needed to know about any settlements the university had made, any complaints that had been filed, any patterns in his behavior over the last 20 years. What they found was extensive. 17 complaints over 2 decades. 12 settlements. Evidence of a pattern that suggested he'd targeted at least 30 students in total. But there was something missing, a narrative. He'd managed to keep things fragmented enough that no single complaint seemed fatal. He'd apologized vaguely, he'd blamed stress or misunderstandings. He'd survived by making sure each incident seemed isolated. So I created a narrative. I organized the evidence chronologically. I reached out to 8 women who'd been his students at various points and asked them if they'd be willing to speak on record, in video testimony, about their experiences. 5 of them said yes. Sarah provided her journals. Jennifer provided screenshots of emails he'd sent her. Others provided witness statements from friends who'd supported them at the time. And I created a documentary. Not a long one, 23 minutes. I filmed it myself, edited it myself, and I released it anonymously on a news platform that specializes in institutional corruption. The video went viral within 48 hours. By the time the university administration became aware of it, it had already been shared 3,000 times. The story hit local news, then regional news, then national news. Marcus Hendricks was suspended from teaching pending an investigation. An official inquiry was launched. 3 of the 5 women in the documentary came forward publicly, providing their names and allowing the university to confirm their enrollment during the years they'd cited. The university's investigation found that they'd failed to adequately follow up on previous complaints. They found that Marcus Hendricks had systematically isolated students and manipulated them emotionally. They found that he'd used his position to exploit power dynamics. They found, in other words, exactly what I'd spent 3 years documenting. He wasn't prosecuted criminally. The statute of limitations had passed for most of the incidents, and the ones that hadn't were considered matters of civil rather than criminal law. But he was fired. He was permanently banned from teaching at any university in the state. His reputation was destroyed. I watched it happen from my restaurant in Portland, where I'd insisted on anonymity as one of the producers of the documentary. Almost no one knows it was me. He sent me a letter. It took a while to reach me. I'd left instructions with my lawyer to track down my address, but it came. I keep it in a safe in my office. In the letter, he told me he knew it was me. He said he recognized the timing, the details I'd included, the way the documentary was structured. He said I'd orchestrated a vendetta born from my own inability to recognize that our relationship had been consensual and appropriate. He said I was damaged and that I'd used my damage as an excuse to ruin a good man. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't apologize. He denied everything, reframed everything, and positioned himself as the victim. I read that letter every single day for a month. And then I put it away. And here's the part that makes me question what I've become. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Not justice served. I felt empty. Because what I'd done was, in a certain technical sense, right. He was a predator. He'd hurt dozens of women. He should have been stopped. By every measure of justice, my revenge was proportional and deserved. But it was still revenge. I'd orchestrated it. I'd manipulated evidence into a narrative. I'd turned his victims into characters in a story I was telling. And the story had worked. It had done what I wanted it to do. So was I the hero or the villain? Was I a survivor finally reclaiming her power, or was I someone who'd become so obsessed with retribution that I'd lost sight of what justice actually looked like? I don't have a clean answer. What I have is a successful restaurant, a reputation I've built through hard work and genuine talent, and a sense that the most profound damage he did to me wasn't anything he did consciously. It was teaching me that the world operates through manipulation and power, and that sometimes you have to become ruthless to survive in it. I'm 35 now. I have a partner who doesn't know the full story. I have a life that looks successful and happy from the outside. I have a sense of closure that I worked for. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my restaurant kitchen at night, doing prep work with no one else around, I wonder if I'm any better than he was. Because he manipulated people. And I manipulated a narrative. He destroyed people's trust. And I weaponized truth. The difference is that he did it for power, and I did it for justice. But the difference between power and justice, I've learned, can be devastatingly small. This confession is the closest I'll ever come to an apology. Not to him, he deserves what he got, but to the part of myself that I sacrificed to make sure it happened. I thought reclamation was about getting my life back. But what I actually reclaimed was the ability to hurt people the way I was hurt, to strategize and plan and destroy, to turn myself into the kind of person who could spend 3 years of her life orchestrating someone's downfall. That's what he taught me in the end. And I'm still not sure if I've forgiven myself for learning the lesson so well.